Hello everyone, and welcome to Fresh Master Channel. Today, we are going to have some story from Reddit. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. These simple clips mean a lot to the future of this channel.
My earliest memories revolve around the simple joys of childhood. Weekend trips to the park, the smell of my grandmother's freshly baked bread, and the laughter that filled our home. As the eldest of 3 siblings, I often found myself taking on the role of protector and guide, a position I wore with pride even as it came with its own pressures. By the time I started school, my curiosity about the world was insatiable. I would spend hours poring over encyclopedias and building elaborate contraptions with my toy blocks, dreaming of becoming an inventor. My father, a quiet but supportive man, encouraged my creativity, often joining me in my makeshift workshops. My mother, ever practical and nurturing, made sure I balanced my dreams with discipline and hard work. At 8, I joined the local soccer team. Though I was far from the most skilled player, I learned the value of teamwork and persistence. Those early years on the field taught me lessons that would carry me through life: how to handle setbacks, celebrate small victories, and push forward even when the odds seemed stacked against me. Summers were some of the most formative times of my youth. My siblings and I would spend weeks at our grandparents' countryside home, exploring the woods and learning the art of patience through fishing trips with Grandpa. These summers taught me a love for nature and a deep respect for simplicity. Watching the way my grandparents worked together, always with kindness and understanding, gave me an idealized view of what a partnership could be. In middle school, I developed a love for problem solving. Science fairs became my favorite outlet for creativity, and I even managed to win a regional competition with a rudimentary solar-powered water purifier. My father's pride in my accomplishment was evident, and he often spoke of my potential to do great things. Those words of encouragement stayed with me, fueling my determination. As I entered high school, my world expanded. New friendships, challenging classes, and the thrill of discovering my own identity kept me busy. I also began volunteering at a community center, helping younger kids with homework and organizing sports activities. This experience taught me empathy and reinforced my belief in giving back to others, values that would guide me well into adulthood. High school brought a mix of triumphs and challenges. I excelled academically, often earning top marks in science and math, but struggled with the social dynamics of teenage life. My time was split between helping my younger siblings with their schoolwork and taking part in extracurricular activities. These experiences instilled a sense of responsibility and independence that would later shape my approach to adulthood. Those formative years, filled with lessons in resilience, creativity, and connection, shaped my beliefs about life and relationships. They gave me the foundation to dream big and trust in the strength of human bonds. But as I stepped into adulthood, I would soon discover how fragile those bonds could be, and how life could test even the strongest resolve. Divorce is one of those things you never expect to touch your life. You hear about it happening to friends, each with their own reasons. But when you trust and cherish your partner, it feels like your relationship is unbreakable. Observing today's divorce statistics, I sometimes question why anyone commits to marriage. The phrase, "till death do us part," seems to have lost its weight over the years. Looking back, I realized the signs were there all along, not from stories or advice columns, but in the subtleties of our daily lives. Love has a way of clouding your perception. With a shared home, children, and a vision of growing old together, it's easy to dismiss the quiet red flags. Yet, in hindsight, those signs were as clear as day. I just wasn't ready to see them. I grew up in what became a single-parent household. My parents' marriage seemed solid. My father worked hard, sacrificing for the family, while my mother returned to work once my younger sister started school. As kids, we didn't understand what was happening, but looking back, I now see the signs. My mother didn't start her affair immediately. It began when I was a teenager, with late nights, business trips, and better clothes. Eventually, my father caught her cheating. He came home early one day and found her in bed with her boss. Despite his outrage, my father couldn't evict her. In a no-fault divorce system, infidelity held no weight. The house belonged to both of them, and she refused to leave. He moved out, unable to live with her, but couldn't afford a place big enough for all of us. So, my siblings and I stayed with my mother. I confronted her, made my feelings clear, and vowed to live with my father when I could. My father was heartbroken, but fought to stay present for us. He tried for custody, but knew the odds were against him. as courts rarely granted it to fathers then. By the time custody was decided, I was old enough to choose him, but my younger siblings stayed with my mother. Thankfully, my father wasn't burdened with unreasonable child support, unlike what happens in the U.S. The years after were tough. I resented my mother and made no secret of it. Any man she brought home was reminded of her infidelity. By 16, we barely spoke. I stayed out as much as possible, working, studying, or avoiding her. Eventually, my father rebuilt his life and met Naomi, a fellow divorcee. She embraced us as her own, and her daughter became like a sister. Though my father was reluctant to remarry, they built a happy life together. Despite the pain, I was glad he found love again. When I turned 18 and graduated high school, I moved out of my father's house. Staying until then had only been for my siblings. My relationship with my mother had deteriorated beyond repair, and my parting words to her were harsh, an outburst of years of resentment over how she'd torn our family apart. As I packed my car, my mother sobbed, but I didn't look back. I hugged my brother and sister, promising to always be there for them. The experience left me wary of relationships. I knew I was monogamous and expected the same from a partner. After high school, I focused on work and dated cautiously, searching for someone trustworthy. At 21, I met Kylie, a recent college graduate, at a corporate event. I was working as an engineer while taking night classes, aiming for a management role. Kylie, a sales rep, impressed me with her humor and warmth. By the end of the event, I had her number. Our first date was casual, a bar in town. She admitted her job was temporary, chosen more for her looks than skills, and mentioned how uncomfortable it was being hit on by married men. We bonded over shared views on loyalty and honesty, and by the end of the third date, we shared our first kiss. As we grew closer, I opened up about my parents' divorce. Kylie was supportive, and her kindness made me feel lighter. Over time, our dates turned into dinners at my apartment. Eventually, we fell in love, and after she found steady work, we began discussing a future together, a home, marriage, and children. We bought a house before marriage, with my father co-signing the mortgage since Kylie's finances weren't in great shape. Her gratitude and my father's support deepened our bond. 3 months after moving in, I proposed, and our families celebrated with us. Our wedding was a joyful outdoor ceremony, followed by a reception under a marquee. The honeymoon on a Pacific island was blissful, and we soon learned Kylie was pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to our daughter. 18 months after that, we welcomed a son. Kylie was everything I'd hoped for, loving, loyal, and committed. Despite my past experiences, I felt lucky to have built a life filled with trust and love. 3 months after our son was born, we decided 2 children were enough. Kylie didn't want either of us to undergo permanent procedures, so she simply returned to birth control, which had always worked for her. Kylie stayed home until our youngest started school, then transitioned to part-time work before resuming full-time employment when both kids reached middle school. By the time we were 45, I had become a regional manager for a national engineering firm, traveling frequently but rarely overnight. Kylie ran her own successful real estate office, occasionally traveling to the city for meetings. Our daughter Charlotte had moved in with her boyfriend, a kind and committed young man, and I assumed they'd marry soon. Our son Stephen was in college, living near campus. While he explored different interests, Kylie and I supported him unconditionally. After more than 20 years of marriage, I believed Kylie and I still loved each other deeply. I never betrayed her trust, even in thought. Yet memories of my father's betrayal haunted me, and when I started noticing small changes in Kylie, those fears resurfaced. "I think she's cheating," I confided to Dave, my longtime friend. "Seriously? Kylie adores you," he replied, stunned. I shook my head. I thought things would improve once the kids left, but she's been acting differently. Secretive, distant. It's like watching my mother all over again. Dave sighed. "What's your plan?" "I'm gathering evidence. If I'm right, I'll leave her. No drama, just an exit." The next morning, I went to my father's house. Naomi, his wife, greeted me warmly. Over a beer, I told Dad my suspicions. "I think Kylie's having an affair," I said. Naomi sighed, and Dad muttered, "Not again." "I've hired a private investigator," I continued. "If I'm right, I'll transfer the house to you. Legally, Kylie doesn't own it since you co-signed the mortgage." Dad frowned. "Are you sure about this?" "Completely," I said. "We agreed on fidelity when we married. If she broke that promise, I'm done. No alimony, no spousal support. She earns as much as I do. The kids are grown, so there's nothing tying us." Later, I returned home to find Kylie on the couch watching a movie. She smiled warmly, her eyes lighting up as always. "Where were you?" she asked. "With Dad," I said casually. "Work stuff, just needed his advice." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. Though I had no solid proof, my suspicions lingered. If she was cheating, she hid it well. On nights I worked late, she still snuggled up to me, whispering how much she loved me. I hoped I was wrong, but I couldn't ignore the signs. The thought that Kylie might be lying hurt deeply, but the possibility of her betrayal hurt even more. Decades of love and trust seemed on the verge of collapse, and while I was preparing for the worst, I still hoped I was wrong. If she no longer loved me, I was ready to let her go. But imagining her with someone else made me sick. I had to trust her until I had proof. It was trust but verify. When I told her I loved her, I still meant it, though the weight of doubt was suffocating. The next day, our morning routine felt normal. Kylie smiled warmly as she wished me a good day, unaware I'd be meeting a private investigator at lunch to arrange surveillance. After 20 years of marriage, I couldn't believe I was in this situation. At lunch, I met the investigator, a professional woman, not the trench coat-wearing stereotype I'd expected. She explained her process and assured me the investigation would be discreet, as Kylie and I kept separate finances. I described the parallels between my mother's infidelity and Kylie's recent behavior, subtle changes, emotional distance, and a fading closeness that I'd chalked up to age but could no longer ignore. By Wednesday, my anxiety was unbearable. I called the investigator to start immediately. I needed answers. The uncertainty was maddening. Within a month, my suspicions were confirmed. Kylie was cheating, and her betrayal was undeniable. By then, I had prepared for this moment. The house, legally owned by my father and me, wasn't in Kylie's name, and I'd quietly moved my belongings out. Friday evening delivered the final blow. Arriving home, I expected our usual routine: wine, conversation, and plans for the weekend. Instead, Kylie was in the bathroom getting ready. When she emerged, dressed in a short skirt, blouse, and heels, I knew something was wrong. "Oh, Mark," she said, startled. "I didn't know you were home." "I got home at my usual time," I replied calmly. "Where are you going?" She hesitated. "I'm meeting John, from work." I stared at her, unmoving. "Why?" "It's work-related," she said, lying blatantly. I knew John, married, with kids our children's age. He was the man she'd betrayed me with. She waited for a reaction, but I gave none. I stood, met her gaze until she looked away, and walked to the kitchen. Grabbing a beer, I waited. "You're not going to say anything, Mark?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "No." She fumbled for words, then gave up. "Fair enough. I'll be back later. We'll talk." I didn't reply. As she left, she turned one last time. Her expression conflicted. "Good night, Mark." "Goodbye, Kylie," I said evenly. And with that, she walked out, leaving behind the life we'd built together. Kylie must have thought I'd tolerate her betrayal, but she didn't know me. I wasn't the kind of man to accept infidelity or entertain ideas like open marriages or arrangements. Such things demean the vows of marriage and were never an option for me. As soon as Kylie left, I put my plan into motion. I grabbed my go bag, packed another suitcase, and loaded the car. Using my phone, I paid off and canceled our only credit card, settled upcoming bills, and transferred most of our joint savings into my personal account, leaving just enough for a couple of months of expenses. The house wasn't in her name, and by the time she realized I was gone, I'd be miles away. Walking through the house one last time, I felt a pang of sadness for the memories now tainted. After pouring myself a beer, I made 3 calls. The first call was to my dad, and the conversation was straightforward. I said, "She's cheating, Dad. She even admitted she's on a date with another man tonight." "The plan starts now." He asked, "Where are you going?" I replied, "To Adelaide. I've got a year-long gig there. Once the divorce is final, I'll figure out what's next." He responded, "I'll make sure she doesn't find you. Got a new number?" I answered, "I'll set it up once I get there and send you my address." He concluded, "Drive safe, son, and remember, you're doing the right thing." I finished the call by saying, "Thanks, Dad. Talk soon." As I called my kids, the next conversation was with Charlotte, my little girl. Telling her was gut-wrenching. She cried, and her heartbreak only strengthened my resolve. I said to her, "I'll always love you. I'll send you my new info once I'm settled." After comforting Charlotte, I called Stephen, who took the news stoically. He stated, "She's a strumpet. What's next?" I replied, "I'll let her affair partner's wife know, then file for divorce. No revenge, just a clean break. He asked, "Can she force counseling?" I responded, "No. As long as we live apart for a year, the divorce will go through. And if she pushes for counseling, I'll share the evidence. The counselor can decide if they'd stay with a cheater." He continued, "Fair enough. Be careful, Dad. You know how courts can be." I assured him, "Thanks, Steve. Watch out for your mom. She might try to spin this." He concluded, "She knows Charlotte and I will stand by you." After those calls, I wrote Kylie a short letter explaining I was leaving and that my father would handle communication. I didn't explain why, leaving her to figure it out. I included copies of the evidence, keeping the originals for court, and left my wedding ring on the coffee table. As I drove away, a weight began to lift. I booked a hotel on the edge of the city, preparing for my trip to Adelaide. With 2 weeks to get there, I took my time, stopping in small country towns with little more than a pub, post office, and police station, sometimes all in one building. A week after arriving in Adelaide, I settled into my new role. Familiar colleagues welcomed me, showed me around, and suggested neighborhoods to consider. I spent a month in a hotel before finding a modern 3-bedroom apartment in North Adelaide, a beautiful suburb that came highly recommended. Renting made sense as I planned to return to Sydney after my 12-month contract, and housing prices, though lower than Sydney's, were still high. Once I moved in, I updated my father, siblings, and kids. Charlotte called immediately, eager to visit, so we arranged for her to stay for a month. Stephen, busy with his studies, promised to visit during Christmas. My father kept me informed about Kylie. One day he shared an update. He said, "She didn't come home until morning." I replied, "I know." The investigators followed her overnight. She had dinner with him, stayed at a hotel, and returned the next day. He continued, "She found your note, the evidence, and your ring. She called everyone, me, the kids, her family. But I assume you didn't answer." I answered, "No, I blocked her calls and marked her emails as spam." He explained, "That's just the start. I presented her with the lease and proof you transferred the house to me. She turned pale when she realized it was all legal. I gave her 3 months to leave, and if she doesn't, the police will handle it." I asked, "Has she explained herself?" He responded, "Not really, just says she's sorry. But, like your mother, I think she's sorry she got caught, not for what she did. Cheaters live in their own world, convincing themselves it's harmless. Mark, you'll get through this. Take time to heal, and when you're ready, open your heart again. There are plenty of good women out there." I said, "Thanks, Dad. Love you." He replied, "Love you too, son." Work kept me busy, traveling across South Australia to meet suppliers and clients. On weekends, I explored the region, especially the Barossa Valley. The divorce toughened me, sharpening my focus at work. My bosses noticed, even suggesting I extend my time in Adelaide. A month after settling in, Charlotte visited. At the airport, she ran into my arms, shouting, "Daddy!" I hugged her tightly and promised, "Once this is over, I'll come home for good." She stayed a week, and though I worked during the day, I spent every evening with her. During our talks, she mentioned Kylie's repeated calls, trying to explain herself. Reluctantly, I shared the investigator's report. By the end, tears streamed down her face. "I hate her," she cried. "That's not what I want, sweetheart," I said softly. "She still loves you, even if she made a terrible mistake." But I knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Saying goodbye at the airport was hard. I held her for what felt like hours before she boarded her flight. Driving home, I let myself cry for the first time since the breakup. Charlotte's visit revitalized me. We talked every night, and Stephen called often. My siblings, especially my younger sister, promised to visit, and old colleagues from Sydney reached out with support and humor. Slowly, life began to feel hopeful again. 6 weeks before Christmas, something unexpected happened. I was wandering the supermarket aisles, bored out of my mind. Grocery shopping used to be something Kylie and I did together. It was fun, full of jokes and shared moments. Now, it felt like an endless chore. Reaching for a bottle of salad dressing, my hand bumped into someone else's. Startled, I turned to see a woman standing next to me, her cheeks reddening as she quickly pulled her hand back. For a moment, I just stared. "I'm sorry," I said, regaining my composure. "No, it's my fault," she replied, smiling nervously. "I didn't see you. Please take the bottle." "I can't do that. It's the last one," I said, surprising myself with unexpected confidence. "How about this? You take it, but only if you agree to have coffee with me afterward." Her blue eyes sparkled behind thin-rimmed glasses as she blinked in surprise, then smiled. "I'm Jennifer," she said, extending her hand. Her touch was warm, her skin soft. "Mark," I replied. So, do you often let strangers pick you up in supermarkets? She laughed lightly. No, you're the first. Are you sure I'm not married? If you are, I'll withdraw my invitation, I said. But if you're not, I hope you'll say yes. She nodded, and I couldn't help but smile back. Her brunette hair framed her face perfectly, and her presence stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. Jennifer took my phone, entered her number, and sent me a quick text to ensure I had it. I'll be done shopping in about half an hour, she said. I'll need to take everything home first, but I can meet you in a couple of hours. Are you local? I asked. Yes, I live nearby. What about you? Same. I hate driving too far just for groceries, I replied with a grin. She rested her hand briefly on my arm, her touch steady and warm. Let me know where to meet, and I'll be there. It's been too long since I've had a coffee shop date. Her tone caught me off guard. There was a tinge of sadness in her voice, something I recognized in myself. I'll text you once I'm home, she added, her gaze steady. Rushing through the self-checkout, I hurried home, dumped my groceries in the fridge, and took a quick shower. Once ready, I texted her to suggest a nearby cafe I'd grown to like. Her reply came quickly. I love that place. Maybe we've seen each other there before. When she arrived at the cafe, she was dressed in a beautiful sundress, more formal than the occasion called for, but she looked stunning. After ordering her a drink, we sat and started talking. Her openness and warmth immediately put me at ease. I learned she was 35, a kindergarten teacher with no children of her own, living alone in a small apartment. Her family, parents, and a younger sister lived in the city. And you? She asked. I'm 45, I said with a laugh. And separated. My wife and I are divorcing. Her face softened. That must be hard. It is, I admitted, meeting her eyes. But I'm doing my best to move forward. Jennifer reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. I know what it feels like to be broken, she said softly. It gets easier day by day. And sometimes you meet someone who starts to mend the pieces. Her words disarmed me. As we finished our drinks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. Outside at her car, I hesitated before giving her a hug. It felt natural, and I didn't want to let go. Call me this week, Mark, she said quietly. How about tonight? I teased, only half joking. Her laugh was soft and warm. You can call me whenever you want. That night, I called her. We talked for hours, and by the end of the week, I asked her to dinner. When she said yes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, pure, unfiltered excitement. For the first time in a long while, I believed life could be good again. On Thursday, my upbeat mood was impossible to miss at the office. My coworkers, knowing about my separation and upcoming divorce, were quick to speculate that I might have started dating again. I didn't deny it, admitting that I had been on a coffee date and had plans for dinner the following night. However, I made it clear, I'm not the kind to date around. It's one person at a time for me. If it doesn't work out, I'll move on. For the dinner date, I picked a casual yet highly rated restaurant I'd been curious about but hadn't visited before. Wanting to make a good impression, I dressed in tailored slacks, a button-down shirt, polished leather shoes, and added a light hint of cologne. When I arrived, Jennifer was already at the bar, looking breathtaking and slightly on edge. As I walked up to her, she stood to greet me, and without hesitation, I leaned in for a kiss. She kissed me back, her hands resting gently on my arms. Wow, she said softly, pulling back just enough to meet my eyes. If this is how you greet me on our second date, I wanted to do this after the first, I admitted with a small smile. Before we could say more, the waiter came over to lead us to a cozy semicircular booth where we could sit side by side. Over drinks, we began talking about our week. Jennifer's enthusiasm for her teaching career was contagious, and when she confided her desire to have children someday, I shared my own dreams. The conversation flowed easily, pausing only when the waiter took our order. We split an appetizer and dessert, but chose individual main courses. Throughout the meal, I found myself captivated by her. The way she spoke, the subtle movements of her hands, her expressions. A few times she caught me staring, and each time her cheeks turned pink. After dinner, we walked to a quiet bar I'd researched earlier. The dim lighting and soft piano music created the perfect atmosphere as we sipped our drinks, her cocktail and my bourbon, and kept talking. What's on your mind, Mark? She asked after a pause, sensing my hesitation. I took a deep breath and decided to be honest. I told her about my marriage, how it began, the life we built together, and the family we shared. Then I shared the difficult truths about my parents' divorce, my strained relationship with my mother, and the ways those experiences had shaped me. As I spoke, I realized my wife had fallen into similar patterns. Finally, I explained why I had left and the steps I was taking now. I'm still technically married, I admitted, my voice low but firm. We live apart, and the relationship is over in every way but legally. I came here to finalize the divorce. I don't know if you'd see that as a form of cheating, and I wouldn't blame you if you did. But my marriage is done. It exists in name only. I'll return to Sydney to finish everything once it's finalized. Jennifer looked thoughtful. And if you meet someone here, she asked quietly. I'd be upfront with her, I said honestly. But my kids are in Sydney, and being this far from them is the hardest part of all. I miss them every day. Her hand covered mine gently, offering comfort. After a moment, she spoke. My ex-husband was, let's just say, not a good man. I was 19 when I met him, and he was 25. My parents tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. I thought I was in love. She paused, her voice softening. At first, I didn't notice the signs. But soon after we married, they became impossible to ignore. He let me keep my job, surprisingly. But everything else was under his control. Little by little, he isolated me from my friends and family. At home, I was nothing more than a servant, and something worse. She hesitated before continuing. If I spoke up, I was disrespectful. If I dressed nicely, I was attention-seeking. Spending money on myself? Irresponsible. Everything I did was wrong in his eyes, and he never hesitated to tell me so. I felt a knot in my stomach. It must have been unbearable, I said softly. She nodded, her expression somber. Eventually, I knew I had to leave. I could see the anger in his eyes, and I was afraid he'd injure me. I called my dad, crying, and begged him to help. He came with my uncles and a few friends. My ex tried to fight back, but he couldn't stand up to a group of men. Her tone brightened slightly. My dad knocked him out with one punch and tied him to a chair while I packed. That same day, I filed a police report, got a restraining order, and started divorce proceedings. It's been 7 years since then. He has no idea where I am, and I haven't dated much because I've been too scared. She looked up at me, her eyes soft. But then I met you, Mark. For the first time in so long, I felt something real, something I never felt with him. I leaned in, kissing her gently. Tonight was wonderful, Jennifer, I said as we pulled apart. I'd really like to see you again. Her smile widened. Anytime you want. I'm not a bad cook. You could come over for dinner sometime? Deal, I said, grinning. But next time, I'll cook for you. We agreed on Wednesday evening. But I expect your usual nightly call and plenty of messages until then, she teased. Play your cards right, and you might even get a surprise or two. What about tomorrow? I asked. What about it? She replied with a playful smirk. Let's go to the beach, I suggested. You just want to see me in a swimsuit, she teased. No, I chuckled. I just want to spend more time with you. Later that night, I saw her text pop up. Jay, I had an amazing night, Mark. I wanted you to stay, but I don't want to rush this. M, I don't want to rush either. But when Wednesday comes, bring a change of clothes. I'd love for you to stay, even if it's just to share the same bed. Jay, I'm tired of being alone, Mark. M, so am I. The following morning, I picked her up outside her apartment. She greeted me with a radiant smile. So, what do you think? She asked, twirling slightly. Do I need a broom to keep the other men away? I chuckled. You look incredible, I said, completely sincere. We spent the day at the beach, starting with breakfast at a cozy little cafe, and then lounging under the sun for hours. As the evening approached, she leaned in close and murmured, Go home, grab a bag, and come back. Stay the night with me. I didn't hesitate. I rushed home, packed quickly, and returned to her place in record time. When she opened the door and saw me catching my breath, she laughed softly, grabbed me by the shirt, and pulled me inside. That night wasn't hurried or frantic. It felt natural, like everything was finally falling into place. The next morning, she made breakfast while we relaxed in a shared, peaceful silence. No words were needed. Just being together felt perfect. Take your time, Jenny, I said gently. We have all the time in the world. Deep down, I already knew I was falling for her, and I could feel she was falling for me, too. Yet a small voice in the back of my mind whispered caution. Was this happening too fast? I had just left a 20-year marriage and found myself captivated by the first woman I met. Still, it didn't feel random. It felt like everything had led to that moment. Meeting her in the supermarket couldn't have been a coincidence. We didn't text constantly. Her teaching kept her busy. But every night, without fail, we talked on the phone. My coworkers noticed the change in me, and I told my family in Sydney that I had met someone special. My dad called one evening, updating me on my daughter Kylie. "She's about to move out," he mentioned. Apparently, she was still searching for me, hoping to run into me in Sydney, not knowing I had already left. By the time Wednesday arrived, I could hardly wait. Jennifer had prepared an incredible dinner, comforting and delicious, with a dessert that left me speechless. As I patted my stomach, I joked, "They say the way to a man's heart is through his stomach." She leaned closer and whispered, "I love you." Her words caught me off guard in the best way. Smiling, I leaned in to kiss her. "I love you too." "Isn't it too soon?" she asked hesitantly. "Not at all," I replied softly. "When it's real, it's real." Her face lit up as she confessed. I felt it the moment we had coffee. I knew I'd met the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Her words moved me deeply. And I mean it when I say, if you ever want to be closer to my kids, I'll make that happen. I'll go wherever you want to be. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and doubt. "That's a huge decision." "There's nothing tying me here," she said with quiet certainty. "My family is doing well, and my heart tells me I should follow you. I'd love to meet your kids." "They'll be visiting for Christmas," I said, unable to hide my excitement. "Then they should spend Christmas with my family, too." That evening, Jennifer came to my apartment for the first time. She glanced around, taking in the sparse decor. "It's very bachelor-like," she teased with a grin. "But it's tidy. And I get it. This place is just a stepping stone." When the topic of marriage came up, she blushed and looked away. Taking her hand, I confessed, "I've been thinking about it, too." "Jenny," I said, meeting her gaze, "I can't remember the last time I felt this much love. Not even for Kylie. And I don't say that to diminish what we had, but because what I feel for you is different. Maybe it's my age, or maybe it's just the way you make me feel. But I love you, Jennifer Morris. One day," she whispered with a smile, "I want to be Jennifer Williams." The weeks that followed felt like a dream. We spent every night together, mostly at her apartment, which felt more like home than mine ever had. Jennifer even spoke to my dad a few times on the phone, though my kids weren't ready to talk to her yet. They wanted to meet her in person first. As Christmas approached, I called Stephen to check in. During our conversation, he revealed something unexpected. Stephen said, "Dad, Lottie and I have been talking. We're thinking of moving closer to you. And Kathy might come too." Jennifer, overhearing, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I asked, "Are you sure, Steve? That's a big decision." Stephen replied, "Yeah, Dad. You're more important to us. Lottie's husband hates Sydney anyway. She'll bring it up when she gets there." The day Charlotte arrived, Jennifer joined me at the airport. As soon as my daughter saw me, she dropped everything and ran into my arms. It reminded me of when she was a child, waiting for me to pick her up from school. She cried for a while before I introduced her to Jennifer, and soon they were hugging too, both in tears. Charlotte's husband, Tom, stood off to the side, giving me a helpless shrug. The next day, Stephen showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. "Dad!" he exclaimed, pulling me into a bear hug. I introduced him to Jennifer, who immediately quipped, "Well, he definitely looks like you." I couldn't help but laugh, knowing what she meant. Years ago, I had done a DNA test to confirm paternity, not out of doubt, but for peace of mind. Back then, I never would have guessed how much my life would change. Later that morning, I loaded everyone into the car and drove us to Jennifer's parents' home. The trunk was stuffed with gifts, which we unloaded before stepping inside. Jennifer's mother instantly hit it off with Charlotte, while her father welcomed Stephen like he was part of the family. They embraced me warmly, already treating me as a future son-in-law. That evening, I video called my father to share Christmas greetings. My siblings and their families were with him, filling the screen with happy faces and laughter. Meanwhile, Kylie had moved back in with her parents. Surprisingly, her affair partner's life had also unraveled. His wife had exposed his infidelity, leading to his firing for misconduct. Kylie wasn't faring much better. She had been demoted at work and abandoned by mutual friends who couldn't overlook her betrayal. Spending Christmas with Jennifer's family felt like a dream. My kids took countless photos for social media, though I didn't pay much attention to that world. Messages from old acquaintances began trickling in, asking about my life. I kept my answers vague, avoiding unnecessary drama. Some shared updates about Kylie, but I brushed them off. It no longer mattered. I was focused on moving forward. In a few months, once the legal separation period ended, I would return to Sydney to finalize the divorce. Jennifer was excited about the idea of joining me in Sydney, but I suggested Adelaide as a possibility, especially since some of my family were considering moving there. Her eyes lit up at the thought, and when I handed her the gift I'd carefully chosen, a beautiful necklace and bracelet, she was nearly in tears. "It's not a ring," I told her with a gentle smile, "but I wanted to give you something special." Her hands trembled as she fastened the jewelry around her neck and wrist. "I'll cherish these," she whispered. "They're perfect." After a hearty Christmas meal, Jennifer's father invited me to his garage. He was restoring an old sports car and handed me a beer as we talked. He began seriously. "Mark, I haven't seen Jenny this happy in a long time. Part of me thinks a change of scenery would be good for her, but are you sure you're ready to settle down here?" I replied, "If that's what she wants, then yes. And my kids are thinking about relocating too." He asked, "How soon can the divorce be finalized?" "Just a few months," I assured him. "I've been completely honest with Jennifer from the start." He nodded but frowned slightly. "I've heard Kylie hasn't made it easy for you." "She hasn't," I admitted, but I didn't have solid proof of her actions until just before I left. Shaking his head in disbelief, he muttered, "I'll never understand people who destroy their marriages like that. Why make promises you can't keep?" We talked for a while longer, and when I mentioned how Jennifer's ex had treated her, his face darkened. "She didn't tell me much about what happened," he said, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "But I know she's been through hell. Just promise me you won't hurt her. I couldn't handle seeing her go through that again." "I love her," I said simply. "I'd never do anything to break her heart." By late afternoon, we headed back home. Charlotte took the wheel since I'd had a couple of drinks. That night, Jennifer pulled me into bed, and the day ended with a sense of perfect contentment. New Year's Eve was even better. We celebrated with dinner and drinks at a downtown hotel, and when we returned to our room, champagne and appetizers were waiting for us. As we toasted the new year, I asked her, "What are your hopes for the year ahead?" Her eyes sparkled mischievously. She replied, "Oh, I have a few. Want to hear them?" I responded, "Absolutely." She continued, "First, I want us to live together." I grinned and said, "Consider it done." She added, "Second, I want you to propose as soon as your divorce is final." I laughed softly. "Already working on that. I've been looking at rings." "And last," she whispered, "I want a baby." I wrapped my arms around her. "We'll get married, and we'll start our family, I promise." When my kids left a few days later, it was bittersweet. I told them about my plans to stay in Adelaide and encouraged them to consider moving closer. They agreed to think it over, and I updated my father on the conversation. "Do what feels right for you," he said. "Naomi and I will always visit no matter where you are." The next few months passed in a blur of happiness. Jennifer and I moved into a new apartment together, a space that felt truly ours. Our relationship wasn't flawless. Trust issues occasionally surfaced, and we faced challenges, but we tackled them together, always committed to open communication. Jennifer's love and support helped me heal and rediscover parts of myself I thought I'd lost. When the time came to finalize the divorce, I was ready. I had already bought an engagement ring, but I knew there was one final hurdle to clear. Jennifer accompanied me to Sydney, nervous but determined to be by my side. At the airport, my father, siblings, and children greeted us warmly. We stayed with my dad while the legal process unfolded. Although I had completed all the necessary paperwork, my lawyer informed me that Kylie was contesting the divorce. "She's trying to delay the process," he explained, "but you followed all the legal requirements. The court isn't likely to side with her." Still, Kylie requested a meeting. "She's willing to sign the papers if you agree to hear her out," the lawyer said. Jennifer supported my decision. "If it helps you move on, I think you should do it," she said gently. My father agreed. "Let her say her piece, son. You're building a new life now. Don't let this hold you back." With a deep breath, I agreed. "All right, let's arrange the meeting." A week later, we were in court. Jennifer sat beside me, her quiet presence giving me strength. As the final pieces fell into place, I knew the end of this chapter was finally within reach. A month and a day after the judge finalized the divorce, I hadn't seen Kylie since the night she walked out for her date. Jennifer and I arrived at the attorney's office, where my lawyer explained that Kylie and her attorney were already waiting in a private room. Only the four of us would be present. Holding Jennifer's hand, I led her inside. The moment we entered, Kylie's eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the sight of me with another woman. I didn't acknowledge her, Instead, I pulled out a chair for Jennifer and made sure she was comfortable before sitting beside her. My lawyer took the seat on my other side. I placed my hand over Jennifer's, resting them on the table where they were clearly visible. She leaned closer, her head gently resting on my shoulder. Only then did I finally look at Kylie. She didn't look good, worn down, as though life had taken a toll on her. I'd heard enough from mutual acquaintances to know her world had fallen apart. She had no relationship with our daughter, and our son barely spoke to her. My family had cut her off entirely, and even her own family supported her more out of obligation than love. I felt no sympathy. She had made her choices, and they had led her here. "All right," I said bluntly. "You wanted to talk, Kylie. Say what you need to so we can finalize this divorce and move on. You're in my past, and that's where you'll stay." Her voice was unsteady as she asked, "Who is she?" Jennifer gave a small smile. "I'm Jennifer Morris," she answered confidently, "Mark's fiancée, as soon as this divorce is finalized. One day, I'll be Jennifer Williams. And I'll say yes," Jennifer added with quiet certainty, "because there's nothing I want more than to be his wife and the mother of his children." I turned to Jennifer with a warm smile before facing Kylie again. "As soon as she accepts, we'll plan a small wedding. With any luck, by the time we're married, we'll already be expecting." Kylie's expression twisted with pain, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of recognition. I knew her well enough to see it was genuine. "You've moved on so quickly," she said bitterly. "I wasn't the one who cheated," I replied, my tone sharp. "That was you. You never explained yourself, and when I walked out that night, you didn't even try to stop me." "I shouldn't have had to fight for you," she shot back. "And I shouldn't have had to deal with betrayal," I snapped. "I was your husband, Kylie. You were supposed to respect our vows. Instead, you destroyed our marriage. Do you regret it? Don't bother answering. I know you don't. You only regret getting caught. After 20 years, you proved who you really are." Her lawyer cleared his throat, but I held up a hand. "She wanted this meeting, so I'll say what I need to." Kylie's voice cracked as she said, "I made a mistake." "Cheating isn't a mistake," I countered. "It's a series of choices. Whether he seduced you or you pursued him doesn't matter. You betrayed me." "It was just Zex," she murmured defensively. I laughed bitterly. "That's the classic excuse, isn't it? You were supposed to be with me, not some guy from work. I warned you before we got married what cheating would mean. I saw it with my own parents, and I saw it happening with you. So I left." "If I hadn't gone out that night, would you still have left?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, but it would have been different. That night you disrespected me on another level. You deserved everything that came after." "You took all our money," she said, anger flaring in her tone. "Consider it compensation for 20 wasted years," I replied coldly, then softened. "No, not entirely wasted. You gave me our 2 kids. That was the only good thing." "You sold our house?" she exclaimed. "I gave it to my father," I corrected. "He rents it out and plans to sell it soon so I can buy a new home where I live now." "You didn't even give me a chance," she whispered. "You didn't deserve one." "Where are you living now?" she asked, her voice hollow. "That's none of your business," I said flatly. "You stopped being part of my life the moment I left. Our kids are grown. They can decide who they want to spend their time with." Kylie fell silent, realizing there was no argument that could sway me. Jennifer broke the quiet. "Just sign the papers and move forward," Jennifer said calmly but firmly. "Mark hasn't spoken to you in over a year. He loves me, and I love him. We're planning a future together. Marriage, children. Everything you threw away. You gave him up, and I picked him up when he was broken. Now he's mine." Tears welled in Kylie's eyes. "I still love you, Mark." "Good for you," I replied, my voice cold. "I don't care. I don't hate you anymore, but don't mistake that for anything else. You stopped being my concern the day you chose someone else." Her lawyer leaned in, breaking the tension. "Kylie, this conversation is over. Just sign the papers. Your marriage is done, your children are adults, and there's no shared property. It's time to move on." The attorney slid the documents across the table and handed Kylie a pen. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. After wiping her eyes, she took the pen with shaky hands and signed her name at the bottom of the papers. It was over. I asked my lawyer, "Do I need to stay in the courtroom?" He replied, "No, Mark, you're free to leave. You'll get the final divorce decree by mail." I responded, "Great, then we're finished." Jennifer stood up, took my hand, and I led her out of the room. As we were leaving, Kylie's voice called out softly. She said, "I'm sorry, Mark. I'll always love you." I acknowledged her apology, but it didn't mean anything to me anymore. It was far too late. I knew she still loved me, but I didn't care. The woman who had my heart was walking beside me, and in just over a month, she would be my wife. Outside, my father, Naomi, Steve, and Charlotte were waiting for us at the cafe. I gave a quick nod toward the nearest pub, and we walked there to grab a drink. After buying our rounds, we gathered at a table, and I shared how the meeting had gone. "What did she look like?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious. "She looked rough." "She's definitely showing her age, maybe even older than that," I answered bluntly. Jennifer leaned in and whispered in my ear, "She definitely needed an upgrade." "Did she sign the papers?" my father asked. I nodded, and we all clinked glasses before taking a sip. "I've been through this before," my father said with a sigh. "I'm sure Kylie tried to pull the same tricks your mom used on me." "She didn't blame me, Dad," I explained, "but she did try the old excuse." "It was just Zex," Stephen said with a shake of his head. "What's with that excuse?" Charlotte wondered aloud. "I married Tom, and I wouldn't dream of leaving him for something so ridiculous. If I want something, I turn to him and—" She suddenly stopped, blushing as she realized what she'd just said in front of her father and grandfather. The room fell silent for a moment, and then we all burst into laughter. "Well said, girl," my father declared. "Words to live by," Naomi chimed in, grinning. "Your grandfather doesn't stand a chance, and if he ever needs help, there's always someone available." "Naomi, that's my grandfather," Charlotte gasped, mortified. "He's not dead yet," my dad protested. "I'm still in my prime at 65. Naomi laughed. "We met at the right time. We both came from failed marriages due to infidelity, but we've promised to treat each other well." "I'm just relieved this is almost over," I admitted. "I hate being a divorcee, but infidelity is a deal breaker for me. I understand some people work through it, but it's something I can't forgive." We stayed in Sydney for a few more days to discuss what would come next. Charlotte and Tom decided to move to Adelaide, while Stephen was still deciding, but seemed to be leaning in the same direction. To my surprise, my sister offered to come as well. Over dinner, she confided that her marriage had ended too. "You're always welcome to stay with us while you figure things out," Jennifer said warmly. "Any family of Mark's is family to me." "I'm selling the house here," I added. "The market's good, and housing is more affordable in Adelaide. We'll get a bigger place, one with room for more. With little ones," Jennifer added, gently placing my hand on her stomach. "I'll be carrying our first child soon." "How many do you want, Mark?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "As many as you want, Jenny," I replied with a smile. I love being a father. A month later, I received the divorce decree, officially ending my marriage to Kylie Daniels. I never heard from her again, though Stephen later mentioned she'd moved to Queensland within 6 months to start fresh. I stopped asking about her, and Stephen stopped giving me updates. It didn't matter anymore. 2 days after receiving the decree, I proposed to Jennifer on the beach in front of our families. She could hardly speak through her tears, but she nodded as I placed the engagement ring on her finger. 6 months later, we were married on that same beach, just a short walk from our new home. As Jennifer walked toward me in her wedding dress, her baby bump was visible to everyone, but all I saw was my glowing bride. She smiled as her father led her to me. I took her hand, and together we faced the celebrant. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." In that moment, the world faded away. Our new beginning had arrived. With retirement just a year away, I couldn't feel more content. Jennifer and I have been happily married for almost 20 years, and our relationship today is just as fulfilling as when we first met. I often find myself reflecting on the early days, our first date, our first kiss, and all the special moments that eventually led to our wedding day. 6 months after returning to Adelaide from that trip to Sydney, both of my children had moved to the city. Charlotte, my daughter, is still happily married to Tom, and they've blessed us with 3 beautiful grandchildren. My son, Stephen, found love with a wonderful man, and together they adopted 2 kids, adding even more joy to our family. A year after my divorce, my father and Naomi moved in with us. Dad lived with us for nearly 10 years before passing away peacefully in his sleep. Naomi was devastated by his loss, and we insisted she stay with us. She resisted at first, but eventually agreed once she saw how much space we had. We built her a small apartment on the property so she could have her own independence while staying close. My sister also joined us after her marriage ended. Like me, she'd been a sufferer of infidelity. Her ex-husband didn't contest her custody of their children, and she stayed with us for a while as she figured out what to do next. Eventually, we helped her find her own place. And to our joy, she later married one of my coworkers and closest friends. They've been happily together for 15 years. My brother stayed in Sydney and maintained contact with our mother, but at the age of 60, I received the news of her passing. After almost 40 years of no relationship, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorrow. Jennifer suggested we attend the funeral. "It's about being a better person," she told me. I agreed, and we flew to Sydney to pay our respects. I was surprised to learn that my mother had remarried and effectively adopted her new husband's children as her own. While they weren't shocked to hear about us, they were surprised to learn that she had never acknowledged being estranged from 2 of her 3 children. We didn't go into the details about why we were estranged. It didn't feel appropriate at a funeral. We simply said we were there to honor her memory before heading home. With no family left in Sydney, my brother decided to relocate to Adelaide within the year. Jennifer and I went on to have 4 more children, 2 boys and 2 girls. My older kids were overjoyed to have younger siblings, and they loved helping with babysitting duties, even though Jennifer and I didn't get out much. Parenthood was demanding, but our love for each other remained unwavering. We made sure to never go to bed angry, and we found joy in simply sharing our lives together. Looking back, I think about the time during and after my divorce. Some might have suggested I should have tried to reconcile with Kylie, but what would have been the point? Walking away without explanation hurt her more deeply, and I didn't speak to her for an entire year until I returned to finalize the divorce. She knew my views on fidelity, and yet she chose to betray me. As for those who believe in reconciliation, I don't agree. Maybe it works for some, but once trust is broken, can it ever truly be restored? I don't think so. There would always be doubt and resentment, and divorce would likely follow anyway. I chose a different path. There was no bitterness or need for revenge, but reconciliation was never an option. I walked away, and in doing so, I found Jennifer, my true soulmate. I still believe meeting her in the supermarket wasn't a random event. It was fate. Though I'm not religious, I sometimes think that perhaps the gods of fate smiled upon me that day. Jennifer's voice broke my reverie as she asked, "Are you ready, Mark?" I turned to see her standing in a breathtaking red ball gown, just as stunning as the day we first met. I grinned and said, "I see you still have the magic." She inquired, "Any updates from the kids?" I replied, "They're either on their way or getting ready to leave." She then asked, "And the little ones?" I responded, "They'll survive the night, as long as they don't burn the house down." Jennifer laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Then we'll have some time for ourselves," she teased. I said, "I love you, wife." She replied warmly, "I love you, husband." "Many more happy years ahead," she said, drawing closer. "I hope so," I whispered. "I'll let the kids know we won't be late." "They'll figure it out," she replied with a grin. Hand in hand, we left for the evening, excited to celebrate yet another wonderful chapter of our full, joyful lives.